6. I had a most beautiful dream. It was in January. In the dream, I received a most beautiful letter in the mail. And I remember in my dream the envelope was so white it glowed, and when I felt it, it felt like pure satin. And in my dream I could feel, in real life I could not, my hands were almost dressed in the most beautiful photography that I had ever seen, and it was addressed to me. And I opened it so carefully I didn't want to tear the envelope. And inside was an invitation. And the invitation said, "Dear Rita, if you will come to my church before the bell rings 12 times, you will see my mother." And it was signed, "Jesus, your loving friend." And in my dream, I said to the Lord, "Lord, how am I supposed to get to your mother's church? And where is this church? I have no idea. And every time your mother comes, she comes so far away. And because of my illness, we had no money. Every penny was spent on physical therapy, on medications and doctor bills, and the family did without even some of the basic necessities. We don't have good health system in America for the poor. And my husband, who taught elementary school, was so financially strapped and worried. He'd spend each month trying to figure out how many dollars he could send to this doctor or that, and how we were going to make it. He didn't know. We even bought our food at food salvage places with no labels on it because it was cheaper. And so I said to the Lord, "We have no money. And when your mother comes, she always comes where there's rocks. Look at Lourdes. Look at Fatima. Look at La Salette. Look at Guadalupe. Rocks, rocks. She should be called Our Lady of the Rocks." And I said, "If you want me to go to your mother's church, you'll have to take me there yourself." And in an instant, I was outside this most very plain church, but it was all white. It had 2 tall towers, and it was totally white. And the next instant, I was inside in the rear of the church, and inside the church was all white. The walls were white, the windows were white, and up front was a beautiful white arch over the sanctuary, and the sanctuary was white. There wasn't a bit of color anywhere. I had never seen a church like this in my life. But the church was filled with people, filled. There were so many people, they were actually up against the altar. And they were all waiting in great expectation and absolute prayerful silence. And in my heart, I said, "I want to be up front. I want to know what they're waiting for. I want to see. I want to see." And instantly, I was up front. And as I stood there, and I was not in my braces, and I was not in my wheelchair, I was standing, the bells in the towers began to ring. And they rang 12 times. And at the end of the 12th chime, there was a mighty rush of wind through the church. And in the wind came a cloud. And from the cloud came Our Lady. And she was so beautiful. She was so absolutely beautiful. And I woke up. And I couldn't believe I was in my bed with my husband sleeping next to me. And I cried, because it was so real. I had never heard of Medjugorje. And there were parts and times in my life when I turned away from God in almost absolute despair. And it had only been in 1981, 5 years before, that I finally came back to the Lord through a great gift that He gave me. But you have to understand, I had MS from the time I was 20. It was the reason I had to leave my community of Servite sisters, because I could no longer live the rule. And the doctor said that if I stayed there, that trying to live the rule, that the stress of it would kill me. And when I applied to Rome for a dispensation upon the advice of my spiritual director, who was a good Jesuit priest, I was told that my vows were invalid because I had made them before I was canonically old enough to make them. You see, I'd entered the convent when I was 15. But in my heart, those vows were valid. And it was with such agony that I left my community. I met my husband shortly after leaving the religious life. I was in remission at the time. He is a good Lutheran. And I remember him calling me on the phone after he had met me at school, where we both taught. And he said, "I would like to date you." And I said, "No, I'm not interested in marriage." And he said, "Well, neither am I. I have an elderly mother I care for." He said, "It'll be a platonic relationship." Oh, yes. And 3 years later, we were married. And yes, he is still Lutheran, but he goes to Mass with me. He's been through RCIA. When the priest asked him if he was ready to make his act of faith, he said no. He said, "I'm not ready. I don't know enough." And it's only been this past Easter that he said to me, "I think I'm ready." The Lord knows what He is doing in our lives. He gave me a most beautiful husband who has supported me and loved me through everything. You see, when I had the MS and he asked me to marry him, I didn't tell him about the MS. I was in remission. And when I was diagnosed, the doctor said to me, this is a clinical diagnosis. There were no MRIs, there were no CT scans at that time. They just simply eliminated every other possible reason for the symptoms that I experienced in the central nervous system. They had spinal taps. That was the one thing they did have to go on. They told me they were 85% sure I did have MS, but in my mind that meant there was a 15% chance that I didn't. And I also knew many people who had MS and who were able to get along clear until the day they died with only a cane, and some you didn't even know they had MS. And so I branded myself one of the lucky ones. God loved me, and it wasn't going to affect my life any more than it already had. We were married. I did not tell my husband. I told him I had post-polio syndrome. And I did that because when I went to my doctor after trying to get employment numerous times after I left the convent, no one would hire me. Everyone said, well, you had a neurological disease. We can't take that chance. And finally, in tears, I went back to my physician. And he said, well, on the back of your employment, you're not putting down you have MS, are you? And I said, oh, yes. And he said, well, that's really stupid. He said, you tell them you had polio as a child. And I said, but that's a lie. He said, no, weren't you educated by the Jesuits? And I said, yes. And he said, we call that mental reservation. Well, I practiced an awful lot of mental reservation. And I got a job. And I practiced an awful lot of mental reservation in what I told my husband, which was very wrong. For the first 3 years of our marriage, we were not blessed with any children, and finally we made arrangements for an adoption. We did not tell anyone. I did not tell anyone about the MS. It would have ruined the adoption. And a week before we were to go and sign the papers, I found out I was expecting a baby. And I was so happy. At that point, I was teaching in a state school, an interim placement facility for children who were severely physically and mentally challenged. And one day the young people came down to my class from the dormers covered with red blotches, and they had rubella. And 10 days later, in my 3rd month, I had rubella. And the titers, they did titers on me. It went over 200, and the doctor said, we have to do an abortion. The baby that you are carrying will be severely, physically, mentally impaired, if it lives at all. But my husband and I do not believe in abortion. And 6 months later, with a massive team of doctors in attendance, I gave birth through a cesarean section to the most beautiful baby girl that you'd ever want to see. Her name is Kristen, and she's now 22 years old, a newly married young lady. And when she was in 8th grade, she wrote a beautiful essay on the sanctity of life and how precious her life is to her. And she won the state Right to Life contest. And never in my life was I so proud as she went up to the Archbishop to receive her award. And my husband and I, we couldn't have been happier. And she explained in there how her mother was sick and how her mother had to choose and how happy she was that she chose life. We were blessed with 2 more beautiful girls, Ellen, who's now 20, and Heidi, who has just turned 17. And they are all beautiful, beautiful young women. And we love each one of them with such a love. And I think it's through the love of our children that we become to understand how God truly loves us so unconditionally. You see, when my daughter Ellen was 16 on her 16th birthday, she was brutally raped. Brutally raped. And it nearly destroyed our family. If it hadn't been for our faith and our love of each other, it would have destroyed us. But God brings goodness out of evil. He turns it around, and when we cooperate with Him, and evil is never victorious. And we have a daughter now who fights for the right to life. She stands outside clinics and urges young mothers who have also been raped to have their babies. She even offers to babysit for them when the babies are born. And she goes and gets clothes for them for the babies. And she is a remarkable young lady, still recovering, still wounded inside, but the healing is coming. And we are so grateful to God. In 1978, though, after the birth of Heidi, our youngest, I had a devastating attack of MS. And at that point, the doctors diagnosed me with what they called progressive spinal MS, which is a very severe form of MS. They told my husband I would no longer have any remission. By this time, my husband found out that I had the MS. And it was a very difficult time in our marriage. I can't begin to tell you how difficult it was. And you know what he said to me when he found out? He said, you know, it's not the fact that you have MS that has hurt me so terribly. He said, it's the fact that you didn't think I loved you enough. That you didn't think I loved you enough. He said, you have no idea how I love you. And he has proved it. I can't begin to tell you how many times. And he is the real hero in my story. He not only had to take care of me, but he had to take care of his mother, who was in her 80s. He had to take care of our 3 darling daughters. And when the doctors told him that within several years that I would be completely bedridden and possibly die after a very long illness, All he said was, we'll take one day at a time. One day at a time. And every day he had to watch me go down. It was my legs. Then it was my arms. It was incontinence, having no control over the most private functions of the body. It was my mind. Sometimes I had no control over my emotions. I would laugh when I should have cried, and I would cry when I should laugh. Sometimes I couldn't talk. Sometimes I had double vision and could hardly manage to get around. But he was always there for me. He was always there for the children. He was always there for his mother. And I know without God's grace, he never could have made it. We never could have made it. During this time, I was not a model patient. I became so angry with God. I remember one Sunday, I said to my husband, he was getting the children and I ready for church. And he never went to church with us. He wasn't Catholic, he was Lutheran. He said, I just don't feel at home in your church. But he had made a commitment, and he was bound to keep it. And I said to him, you don't need to bother getting us ready. I'm not going. And he said, why aren't you going? I said, I'm not going because I get into church and all I do is fight with God. I feel nothing inside anymore. I'm dead inside. And he said, well, I'm taking you, and I'll put your wheelchair outside the door. And he said, and whether you go in or not is up to you. And I'll be back in an hour to pick you up. And it was cold and it was rainy, and I went inside. A few weeks later, I had a friend who called me. I didn't have too many friends left because everyone would say to me, oh, you poor person, you. Oh, you poor thing, you. And I hated it. Oh, I know how you feel. I'd say, how you do you? And I would get so angry at them. And finally, they didn't call me very often anymore. And I couldn't get out to go anyplace. They had a step. How were they supposed to get me up and down the steps in a wheelchair? I couldn't even go visit my own family, who lived 1,000 miles away. Even to get there was a chore in the first place. It took 2 days. And the next chore was once I got there, how was I to get into their homes? Even my own mother and father. To go any place was a problem. It was like being in prison. But this woman called me. Her name was Mary Ann. And she said, there's going to be a mass of healing at St. Ferdinand's. This was in 1981. And I said, a mass of healing? And she said, yes. I said, I don't want to go. And she says, oh, but it's so wonderful, and many people are healed. I said, listen, Mary Ann, I'm a scientist. I have a degree in biology. I'm working on a master's degree. I said, I'm not an idiot. There is no such thing. It's not scientific. It happened 2,000 years ago. Not today. And she said, oh, you should just go find out. And she kept calling me all week. And I kept arguing with her on the phone. And she said, oh, but she said, you've seen them on TV. Ah, that really did it. I said, yes. She says, they're healed. I said, no. I said, they call them up, oh, you in the purple dress, come up and be healed. And I said, they come up, the poor stupid people, and they put hands on their heads and they fall backward. She said, yes, slain in the spirit. I said, no, they got pushed and they fell down and they're too embarrassed to get up. I said, I remember in the convent when I was 15, the first week, the prayers went on forever. We had meditation, we had morning prayer, we had divine office, we had mass. In the middle of meditation, I fell asleep and I fell out of my pew in the aisle. And I pretend I fainted, and I made those poor old nuns come and pick me up, and I'm a big girl, and carry me out of chapel. Well, my husband was standing there listening to all this, and he said, "What is this all about?" And I said, "She wants me to go to a healing mass." He said, "Why don't you go?" He said, "You are so selfish." He never talked to me like that. He said, "You only think about yourself." He said, "We've been to doctor after doctor after doctor, specialist." He said, "There's nothing they can do." He said, "You go." He said, "You do it for me. Okay, if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for me." So mentally I thought, all right. And Marianne said, "You don't have to go up and have them lay their hands on you. At the end of Mass, they'll call up anybody who wants to come. You don't have to come up." And I thought, oh, goody, because I'm not. No one's touching me. We got to the church. It was so full. There was no room. And I was not in my wheelchair that day. I had my braces. I had big braces on. I had surgery, and I had had 3 surgeries on my right leg. And in early spring of '81, I'd had another surgery to remove the pressure that was pushing on the sciatic nerve in my right leg. And they did what was called a radical retinacular release. And when they were finished, my right kneecap looked at my left leg. And they put braces on. My right leg was a fixed brace. It was a stiff brace. It did not bend. And it had a special leather cap that went around my brace and over my kneecap to keep it from banging into the bar, the lateral bar on the inside of the leg. And the other knee would bend, and I had a keeper on it so I could stiffen the brace to walk with my crutches. And when I'd sit down, I could loosen it so it would bend. So I was in my braces, who were hooked onto big, heavy orthopedic shoes. And when I got to the doorway and I saw there were no seats, I was ready to turn around and go back, and all of a sudden these very over-solicitous ushers saw me. And it was like a conspiracy. "Oh, there she is. There's one. Go get her," you know. And I had one on either side of me, and they were practically dragging me up the aisle, and my crutches, I remember, were dangling off my arms. And they came to a pew that was already full of people. And everybody looked up, and pretty soon everybody was sitting like this. And they squeezed me on the end and put the crutches on the floor, and no sooner was that done and the music began to play. "Abba, Abba, Father," and everybody stands up. And I thought, well, I'm not going to sit here and be conspicuous. One of the things about me was I could take care of myself. So I grabbed the pew in front of me and began to try and pull myself into an upright standing position. And as I did, they had waxed the pew. And I began to slide off. And the terrazzo floor was like glass. And I began to slide under the pew in front of me. And in a minute, everybody around me was grabbing my arms, grabbing my crutches, putting a book in front of my face and trying to sing at the same time. And I was so embarrassed. I was going to stand up so they wouldn't notice me. So everyone is singing beautifully, and not me. I'm looking at all these people thinking, my Lord, they're going to put their hands and bless all of these people? This is going to take forever. I'll never get out of here. And I began to count the priests as they came up the aisle, thinking, well, if we have 100 priests, we'll get out of here fast. If we have 5 or 6, we're in trouble. And I got to number 9 when I heard a voice and a stage whisper yell, "Wait!" And I saw the priest going by me, poke the one in front of him, and at the same moment, somebody very sneakily grabbed me from behind. And a great big bear hug from behind. And I was trying to keep my balance and hold on for dear life, and I looked over my shoulder, and here was this priest behind me, hugging me from behind, and with his eyes shut, and he was praying. And I said to myself, Marianne told me they wouldn't do this till after Mass, and they'd ask. So as you can see, I was not having any holy thoughts at all. And in a moment, all the priests came, and all the people around me came. It was like being engulfed in a tent of arms. Everybody's hands were over me. And it was all of a sudden the most incredible experience of my life. And I say this because it was the most incredible experience of my life. when I used to witness many, many places, the people would say to me, especially the non-Catholics, "Oh, how was your life after Jesus healed you? How did it change your life?" And always I tell them, my life did not change after I was physically healed, except that I could run and do the Lord's work. But this day, in 1981, that's when my life changed. Because as those people prayed over me and those good priests of the Lord, I was enveloped in the most incredible light. And everyone was blocked out. And the only thing I can compare it to was when I was 9 years old, I had a near-death experience as I was drowning. That's in my book. And that's what led me to the convent. And it was like being so loved. I can't describe. I felt so loved. It was like love invaded me. And I found myself praying the first real prayer I'd said in several years. And I said, "Dear God, I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know what you want, but whatever you want, you can have." And I went home from that Mass with the most tremendous healing that the Lord has to give, and it's available to everyone because it is the spiritual healing. It was giving me back my life, the life of my soul, so I could live again and love again and be loved again. And my life changed then. And I became the most happy and the most grateful person, I think, on the face of the earth. It was like being born all over again. And I found joy in my family and joy in my children. I found joy in prayer, and I had the most incredible peace. And that peace is so precious. Never, ever would I risk losing it. Ever. And I went back, believe it or not, to daily Mass and communion in a wheelchair. And my pastor offered me a job teaching in the parochial school, teaching religion and music to the children from a wheelchair. And the next 5 years, I call them my time of mercy and time of incredible grace, because the Lord so worked in me. And people would ask me, I remember once we were at a parish mission, and I was sitting outside of my wheelchair waiting for my husband to pick me up, and a good Franciscan priest who was conducting the mission said to me, pointing to my chair, "Is that temporary or permanent?" And I said, "Permanent." He said, "Do you ever ask for a healing?" And I said, "Oh, no." Because in my heart, I'd given everything to the Lord. I said to the Lord, "You can have anything you want." And I knew this time was precious, and I knew that my sufferings were precious to the Lord, and that He used these for the conversion of other people. And I knew how precious my conversion was to me. How could I deny that to others? And I couldn't say to the Lord, "I've had enough, now you can take it away." So I didn't ask. And He said to me, "Well, when you do ask," He said, "be very careful what you ask for." Okay, I'll be praying for you. I thought, that's a strange thing to say. But you know, there are no coincidences with the Lord. Coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous in our lives, and I see that more and more. And the more you fall in love with the Lord, the more you let Him take control of your life, the more you see this, right? Ah, yes. I know you know. So the next 5 years was a time of mercy. It was also a time of great pain, because my MS became very, very bad, to the point I lost the major use of my arms and legs. I was diagnosed at the last hospitalization with quadriparesis, that's incomplete paralysis of both the arms and the legs, and numerous other problems. I had a permanently deformed right leg. I had dropped ankles. Without my braces, I walked in a gait. My Achilles tendons had shrunk so bad I couldn't get my heels on the floor anymore, and the physical therapy was excruciating. Finally, all we did was range of motion to try and ease the contractures. And the doctors told my husband that there was no way I would ever get better. He said, even if she goes into remission now, the damage is permanent. It's irreversible. She will just stay at the level she's at now. There's no way she'll ever be better. She just wouldn't get worse. But God had other plans. And after the dream I had in 1981, I heard about Medjugorje, about the reported apparitions of Our Lady Queen of Peace. But I didn't have any pictures of what the church looked like or what the children looked like. It was a simple article in Reader's Digest. And I was longing to learn more about it. And I went to my pastor and I said, "Have you ever heard of Medjugorje?" "What?" He said, "Oh, stick with Fatima, stick with Lourdes. You don't need all that stuff." But I did. And through God's will, and that's in my book, the whole story of how this happened, I received a book on Medjugorje. And I began to live what Our Lady asked. And 6 months later, in June, when school was out, it was a most beautiful summer day. It was warm. I remember that night on June 18th, and I was lying in my bed. My children had come in for a little bit. My husband was down watching the news when I heard the most incredible, sweet voice. And it said, "Why don't you ask?" I remembered Joan of Arc. She heard voices. They burned her at the stake. But my curiosity was really piqued. And besides that, I was a little frightened. And I said, "What is it I'm supposed to ask for?" And immediately this prayer was given to me to say, and it was whole and complete. I didn't make it up. I didn't think about it. It was there, and I found myself praying it out loud. And I said, "Dear Mary, my mother, Queen of Peace, whom I believe is appearing at Medjugorje, please ask your son to heal me in any way I need to be healed. I know your son has said that if you have faith and you say to the mountains, move, that they will move. I believe. Please help my unbelief." And immediately I felt this feeling like effervescence through my body. And when I awoke the next morning, I remembered nothing. I was supposed to be at a scripture class at the university. My husband got my wheelchair in the car, and I arrived at the class with my hand controls. And in the middle of the class, I felt this rush of heat through my body, and the healing began. I was so wrapped up in what was happening to me, I wasn't listening to the priest, the theologian, who was telling the class, who was composed of about 70 catechists from the diocese, that there were no such things as miracles. That when Jesus walked on the water, he was walking on a sandbar. And when Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fishes, he merely got the people to sit down and share their picnic lunches. And when the man who was born blind was healed of his blindness with the spittle of Christ mixed with the clay of the earth, that there were enzymes in the clay that probably could be explained today by computer, we'd find out what the analysis was. That these stories were only written to prove to the people about 300 years after the death of Christ and the resurrection, if there was a resurrection, that Christ was indeed the Son of God. And they were called miracle stories because that's what they were, miracle stories. I didn't know this was going on. And I didn't find out about it until several months later when I was called to witness to these catechists. And I walked in and they saw me and they said, "You were the one in the wheelchair in our class." See, again, God has a tremendous sense of humor. And there's no such thing as coincidence. By the end of class, I could feel there were wrinkles in my shoes. And I don't know how I made my way home that day, but I did. And my husband and children had gone strawberry picking, and when they arrived home, I had already called my girlfriend in. When I got home, I'd taken off my braces, and when I did, I saw my right leg was perfectly straight. The kneecap was back in place. I took off my braces, my stockings, my shoes, of course, were hooked to the braces, and I began to go through the house praising the Lord. I began to scream, my God, my leg is straight, my leg is straight. And I finally reached the balustrade, going up to the second floor, and I remember putting my hand on the balustrade, and it was like the Lord said, don't you let go of the stupid crutches. You're totally healed. He showed me my whole life from the time I had the near-death experience until the night before, and I realized I was totally healed. And I put the crutches in the corner. And I remember saying, "Dear God, if I'm healed, I can run up the steps." And I did. I ran up to the second floor of the house. And by that time, I was a raving lunatic. And I ran outside, and I was screaming and yelling and praising the Lord. And finally, I ran back into the house. I'd run over the creek. I'd run through the woods. And I was standing in the middle of the floor, and I had called my pastor and screamed to him and He kept saying, who is this? Who is this? I kept saying, it's Rita. I don't have a mess anymore. I don't have a mess. He says, is there anybody there with you? And my dog was there. He said, you sit down, you take some aspirin, and you call your doctor. So I had called my girlfriend, Marianne, and she arrived. And when she arrived, I was standing in the middle of the living room floor with twigs in my hair and my skirt up in my waistband, covered with dirt from the creek, and praising God. And praising God. And she finally realized, she has no wheelchair, she has no, what is this? And we were both dancing around. And finally we collapsed on the hearth, and I told her what happened. And she said, do Ron and the girls know? And I said, no, they're picking berries at the farm. She said, get in my car, we'll go show them. So we did. And on the way up, she said, have you told anyone? I said, I tried to tell my pastor, Father Charlie, and I said, I don't think he believed me. She said, we have to go right past the rectory. Why don't we show Father? It was the only time I'd ever seen anybody's eyes go like this. And Father kept yelling, sit down, you'll hurt yourself. And I kept saying, I want to kneel down, would you just give me a blessing? I have to go find my husband and children, they don't know. And afterwards, as he blessed me and I went out the door, he kept saying, you be careful, you go see your doctor. Well, Father now loves, it's made the biggest difference in our parish priest. He says Mass so reverently now. And he's been to Medjugorje. He took half the parish to Medjugorje. And he submitted all my documents to the bishop. And this is the 10th year, my 10th anniversary of the healing. And they've gone to Lourdes, to the medical commission there. And this is the year everything is made final, because there's absolutely no sign of the disease. I've been studied by doctors. They have written up reports. They can find nothing. The MRIs are fine. The inside studies of the bladder and everything are fine. There's absolutely no sign of the disease anywhere. And I ask you in your great love, yes, Lord. That's not for me, that's for God. Don't ever say he can't do it. No one can take God and put him in a box and tell God what he can and cannot do. And I ask you in your great love to please pray for me, as I will pray for you. And I ask you to do what Our Lady asks. And the main thing she has asked for is that we pray, pray, pray. And that's why my retreats are on prayer, prayer, prayer. Pray with the heart. Talk to the Lord. Tell him. You don't have to read to him. He loves your individual words that come from each of your needs and your wants and your trials and your joys. Share every item, every moment of your life with the Lord. Invite him to be present in you, to enjoy the beauty of your land, to enjoy the beautiful people who the Lord has appointed from all eternity to live with you. And in parting, I'm going to tell you a dream that I had, because it's very precious to me, and it helped me understand what the Lord wants from each of us. And in this dream, Jesus was in blue jeans. He was very young, and he had a beautiful white shirt and a red worker's apron on, and he was in a workshop. And he took out from a bucket the most incredibly ugly stones, and he put them in a can with some sand, and he hooked them up to this machine, and it made the most terrible racket. And he didn't say anything this whole time. He just kind of stood there and he smiled at me. And finally, the racket ended. He turned it off and he went over to the sink and he poured water, and then he showed me the most beautiful gems I had ever seen. And the next minute, the gems were in his crown, and he was the King of heaven. And he let me understand that we are those ugly stones. And the trials and tribulations that God puts in our life, the everyday griefs, are the sands and the pebbles. And the people he puts in our life also rub against us. But they're there for a reason. There is no coincidence. Every person you meet is sent by God. And they take a little bit of heaven away from you with themselves, or the other place, by the way we treat each other. But we are those gems. And when we offer up the daily little troubles, we don't have to go far to find them, that we are polished and made beautiful to become jewels in the crown of Christ the King forever. Amen. I had made them before I was canonically old enough to make them. You see, I'd entered the convent when I was 15. But in my heart, those vows were valid. And it was with such agony that I left my community. I met my husband shortly after leaving the religious life. I was in remission at the time. He is a good Lutheran. And I remember him calling me on the phone after he had met me at school, where we both taught. And he said, "I would like to date you." And I said, "No, I'm not interested in marriage." And he said, "Well, neither am I. I have an elderly mother I care for." He said, "It'll be a platonic relationship." Oh, yes. And 3 years later, we were married. And yes, he is still Lutheran, but he goes to Mass with me. He's been through RCIA. When the priest asked him if he was ready to make his act of faith, he said no. He said, "I'm not ready. I don't know enough." And it's only been this past Easter. And it was totally white. And the next instant, I was inside in the rear of the church. And inside the church was all white. The walls were white, the windows were white. And up front was a beautiful white arch over the sanctuary, and the sanctuary was white. There wasn't a bit of color anywhere. I had never seen a church like this in my life. But the church was filled with people. Filled. There were so many people, they were actually up against the altar. And they were all waiting in great expectation and absolute prayerful silence. And in my heart, I said, I want to be up front. I want to know what they're waiting for. I want to see. I want to see. And instantly, I was up front. And as I stood there, and I was not in my braces, and I was not in my wheelchair, I was standing, the bells in the towers began to ring. And they rang 12 times. And at the end of the 12th chime, there was a mighty rush of wind through the church. And in the wind came a cloud. And from the cloud came Our Lady. And she was so beautiful. She was so absolutely beautiful. And I woke up. And I couldn't believe I was in my bed with my husband sleeping next to me. And I cried, because it was so real. I had never heard of Medjugorje. And there were parts and times in my life when I turned away from God in almost absolute despair. And it had only been in 1981, 5 years before, that I finally came back to the Lord through a great gift that He gave me. But you have to understand, I had MS from the time I was 20. It was the reason I had to leave my community of Servite sisters, because I could no longer live the rule. And the doctor said that if I stayed there, that trying to live the rule, that the stress of it would kill me. And when I applied to Rome for a dispensation upon the advice of my spiritual director, who was a good Jesuit priest, I was told that my vows were invalid because I was 6. I had a most beautiful dream. It was in January. In the dream, I received a most beautiful letter in the mail. And I remember in my dream, the envelope was so white it glowed. And when I felt it, it felt like pure satin. And in my dream, I could feel. In real life, I could not. My hands were almost... dressed in the most beautiful calligraphy that I had ever seen, and it was addressed to me. And I opened it so carefully I didn't want to tear the envelope. And inside was an invitation. And the invitation said, "Dear Rita, if you will come to my church before the bell rings 12 times, you will see my mother." And it was signed, "Jesus, your loving friend." And in my dream, I said to the Lord, "Lord, how am I supposed to get to your mother's church? And where is this church? I have no idea. And every time your mother comes, she comes so far away." And because of my illness, we had no money. Every penny was spent on physical therapy, on medications and doctor bills, and the family did without even some of the basic necessities. We don't have good health system in America for the poor. And my husband, who taught elementary school, was so financially strapped and worried. He'd spend each month trying to figure out how many dollars he could send to this doctor or that, and how we were going to make it. He didn't know. We even bought our food at food salvage places with no labels on it because it was cheaper. And so I said to the Lord, "We have no money. And when your mother comes, she always comes where there's rocks. Look at Lourdes. Look at Fatima. Look at La Salette. Look at Guadalupe. Rocks, rocks. She should be called Our Lady of the Rocks." And I said, "If you want me to go to your mother's church, you'll have to take me there yourself." And in an instant, I was outside this very plain church, but it was all white. It had 2 tall towers.